you'll finally get your wish when Artemis 3 lands and they'll show that there's nothing there.
That's what I'm looking forward to. But
Yeah.
we've got that coming up now. The Deathbed Confession. That's the next issue of Nexus, out in early September, or end of August in America. It's an interesting article because it shows what was really happening back in the late 1960s and how it was faked, where it was filmed, who did it, who was present. It's all there from the president of the US downwards.
I thought we'd do a little bit more on vacuum and the fact that this man has nothing to do with Apollo moon hoax or anything else. He's simply demonstrating what happens to materials when subjected to space. And anybody that wants to watch the video is more than welcome to, because the equipment that he's using his own simulated light source to replicate the intensity of the sun, displaying his testing materials, his vacuum chamber, and the materials that he put in it to show the effects of space and natural sunlight, that items would be exposed to different materials.
Yep.
So he put some food items in, he put mylar in, which is, of course, the entire lem is covered in mylar. Foil-lined mylar is what he put in. And, of course, film is also mylar, exact
Yep.
same plastic polymer. And he goes through the entire demonstration in his video to show the effects. And he's included a light bulb in there which replicates the intensity of the sun, included the UV and ultraviolet infrared radiation included in it, plus the heat of the sun. So basically he's replicating approximately 250 degrees inside his chamber. And then he shows the effects of the materials on there. He also shows the vacuum that he's capable of producing with his chamber. And when it's completely empty, with nothing in it, off-gassing, he said he could bring it down to 1 micron, which is equivalent to 10 to the minus 3. So when he puts the materials in and he brings it down, he also has a diffusion chamber as well in there, which is liquid nitrogen, which it kind of freeze dries and removes the materials that are off-gassing. That's the intent version of it. And the amount that was coming off actually filled that chamber. He had to reset it one more time after doing that in this experiment, which is quite interesting. But the effect of sunlight in space without our atmosphere blocking more than 50% of the intensity of the sunlight coming into the Earth's surface. I think 93% of UV radiation is being blocked coming to the Earth's surface. So when you include all of that in there and the materials are exposed to that, and he did it for just a 24-hour period, and he shows the results of the pieces of material he put in there, and of course he actually ate the beef. He also put a lithium-ion battery that was in a cell phone, and it literally exploded the cell phone. And that's absolutely amazing, the effects of that, because he was only down to 50 microns. He didn't even get to 10 to the minus 3. He was just beyond 10 to the minus 1 with his vacuum, with all of that equipment, with the diffusion, with the liquid nitrogen diffusion. The off-gassing stopped his machine from being able to pull it down to its maximum capabilities. And he's not part of trying to prove it's a moon hoax or anything else. He's simply demonstrating the effects of materials and how they break down when subjected to that environment.
In fact, there was no indication at all that he was referring to any of the Apollo missions. It was just a standard scientific test of what a vacuum does to various materials.
Yeah. And that just in a 24-hour period, imagine what happens if you leave it there.
50 microns is 0.05 torr.
10 to the minus 1 is 100 microns. 10 microns is 10 to the minus 2. 1 micron is 10 to the minus 3.
Not a very hard vacuum.
No.
Quite a mild vacuum. But he's talking about outgassing, which is a standard procedure in a vacuum. He looks at cold welding, which is also a standard procedure in a vacuum, at relatively low vacuum levels, not the hard vacuum we find on the moon, torr 10 to the minus 12, mainly because he wasn't attempting to relate it to the Apollo programs and what the materials on those programs would have been affected by. He wasn't attempting to do that. It doesn't mention Apollo. This is just vacuum testing.
What he's demonstrating is that very specialized materials need to be made to survive just in the vacuum of space, even in low Earth orbit.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's a point you brought up before, because the official NASA documentation about these tests done by normal commercial companies in the US, at the end of their testing, they said improvements have to be made to ensure that the integrity of the materials in space, which is a reasonable conclusion to reach. What we don't see is what those improvements were and how they were tested, because there were no improvements made. So all the commercial companies, all the contractors working with NASA made more or less the same point. Things have to be improved, things have to change, which is a reasonable conclusion to reach. I mean, these are scientific companies testing these materials, and they were doing it on behalf of NASA, and they reported back to NASA, this is our conclusion. Things have to be improved, things have to be retested when they are manufactured, but none of that testing ever shows up.
You won't find a file on any of it. Look for the PDF files on it, on the report server, on NASA. Everything is there that they produce for a PDF file. You will not find test results specifically on materials anymore because of Joyce Deaver. They just removed all of those.
Yeah.
But I've been looking for the test results from the latest spacesuits.
Also, RASA published the radiation readings from Zohar and the other test dummy that was on the Artemis 1 project. So they are now published. We went through them on Saturday, and the radiation readings don't really make a lot of sense, as we have to do a lot of conversion because they didn't put it in rads. The problem with that was that they just did it to confuse people, is what ended up happening. But the radiation readings were so low that it was ridiculous for this craft being out there bombarded by this cosmic radiation. And the only excuse that they had was because of these carbon boron nanotubes.
Yeah.
So that was their excuse. So in other words, it was almost 3 times lower than Apollo. Apollo was 0.05 rads. This was 0.33.
So not a vast difference.
No.
It's almost as if they're trying to relate the Artemis results to Apollo. So people like us don't pick up on it and say, well, you said that they were low on Apollo.
So in other words, what they were doing was the Artemis readings were in milligrays and the Apollo readings were in rads. So when we did the conversion, it ended up turning out to be 33 point something grays. When you change that over to rads, the whole thing is when you pull up the scale and you look at rads and you convert that to millisieverts, Apollo was actually 0.05 rads.
And the other part that they relate to always when they're doing it is absorbed radiation based on what the human body can absorb. They never give you what's actually out there. They only give you what they claim they can block and then what the absorbed radiation is into the body. Now, the outside of the craft is receiving 100% of that, and if they bring it back and put it in a museum, it's going to be irradiated, and you should be able to read it. That's the whole point. But they're giving the absorbed after all of their protections and everything else. But that absorbed amount is over a given amount of time, and they don't give you the timeline on that either.
No, and the other problem is why didn't they need these carbon borite nanotubes back in 1969? You know, where were they? They didn't need them.
These nanotubes are quite heavy.
Yeah, they are, because they're a product of lead.
Yeah, lead-based product. They just give them a fancy name, and it's just lead.
You'd think, wouldn't you, that if everything worked so brilliantly well on Apollo, it protected all the astronauts and all the equipment, don't forget it was equipment that was made 50, 60 years ago, They just resurrect that. They must have the records somewhere. Oh no, they destroyed them, sorry. So they can't go back. Isn't that convenient?
They have restored everything about Apollo. They have redone the computers, everything in Houston. They have redone the suits, cleaned them and restored them back to nice original condition. Well, if they can do that, they can also build that suit because it worked really well.
It did. It worked very well. It worked for 6 missions. Well, 9 missions altogether, but 6 that landed humans on the lunar surface, we're told. That's what they want you to believe. It's sad.
Yeah, and it's up to NASA to prove their claim. It is not up to us anymore. After 50 years, it is on them.
And it's also down to NASA to prove that their newly appointed astronauts are going to be safe. And they have to be persuaded that they're going to be safe. And if they're told all these strange stories about how they can protect them from radiation, and then if they ever get them out there on Artemis 3, put astronauts into space, and they get ill, game over. End of story. NASA, you lied. You couldn't protect astronauts in space if that happens. We'll wait to see if it does.
Well, I think that another part of that experiment the gentleman was doing by using the simulated sunlight, and he does go through what the intensity should be. He did claim that he got it correct. If that sunlight is doing that and heating that material up, because there's no protection in space from that UV and infrared radiation,
Yeah, to cook the
those
chicken.
suits need a whole different method to cool them down because they're just continuously going to be heated up on one side of it, and they have to balance that. It's going to have an entire circulatory system within that suit to balance that heat out and to be able to remove it.
Yeah, it's the removing of the heat that's important. There's only one way to remove heat in space, and that's radiation. You radiate the heat away. There's a black body formula to calculate what the internal temperature of a body heated by the sun in space actually is. It involves the Stefan-Boltzmann constant, which is fairly complex. So we're not going into too much detail there, but you have to remove heat from inside a spacecraft, which is spending 24 hours a day in sunlight. You have to remove the heat. Air conditioning doesn't work in space. There's nowhere to put the heat, nowhere to dump the heat. On Earth, there's an atmosphere. That's where the heat is dumped. In space, there's no atmosphere, so there's nowhere to dump the heat. So you have to be able to radiate the heat away from the object that is being heated. And that's not what appears to be happening.
There are some claims that they had in the suit that the water that was within the spacesuit, the heat was collected in there and then it was expelled.
Yeah, makes a good story, doesn't it?
Yeah, but you never see that being expelled in any of the videos.
No.
You should see that coming out of there.
Because if you did see the water being expelled, remove the heat, anybody with a modicum of understanding of mathematics could calculate the amount of water required to remove a specific amount of heat. And there wasn't enough water being carried on the astronaut spacesuits, the PLSS, Portable Life Support System, the backpacks. There wasn't enough water being carried. Maybe enough for about 20 minutes, but not enough for 8 hours, which is what some of the astronauts spent outside. Something doesn't add up here. Just about heat. I mean, it doesn't add up about a lot of things. But the amount of heat required to be removed to keep an astronaut at a reasonable working temperature, say of about 20 centigrade, 70 Fahrenheit, the amount of heat required to be removed is quite significant. So the amount of water required to remove that heat can be calculated.
You have to account for the body heat coming off when you're in the suit as well.
Exactly. The body heat the astronaut produces, it's about 100 watts, working hard. And I'm sure they're working very hard on the lunar surface for 8 hours. So how is the heat removed? Come on, you parrots, let's hear the answer, or what you think the answer is, and we'll deconstruct it for you. It's not difficult.
It is pretty amazing how NASA is silenced all the time. They don't respond to us. The people that are a little more intelligent, like Neil deGrasse Tyson and whatever, and Brian Cox, I mean, they just disappeared into the woodwork. And if they had the knowledge and understanding, they would set us straight.
Brian Cox, who's not the actor playing in Succession, or wherever he did. He's the astrophysicist in the UK who talks about all these subjects because he's such an intelligent person, and he presents TV programs about space and about the universe. And we all listen to him because he's quite a personable chap. But on the Owlist website, that's owlist.com, many years ago was posted an open letter to Brian Cox asking him various questions about the statements he had made. I said it was posted many years ago. He still hasn't replied. You must know they're there. People don't forget to look at something that's addressed directly to them. But an open letter to Brian Cox? No replies yet.
Yes, I recall reading that one. That's been probably up for 15 years, hasn't it?
The open letter to Brian Cox, 7 questions and a request, has now been read by Apollo researchers all over the world. Fortified by your newfound delight in receiving difficult questions and your claim that science is easy, the Wielden lecture, your considered response to my previous 7 questions, together with the content of this letter, is again invited and will be much anticipated.
At the start of question 6, I'm going to hit that link and see if it's there on radiation, unavailable.
Oh, somebody's getting up cold feet about this because they're very, very good questions that David Orbell has posed. He's knowledgeable about the space program, so he's somebody who can be considered knowledgeable about the subject.
Right there, that's the link I clicked on, so I opened it in a new window, and there it is, unavailable.
Ah, wow.
Okay, and close this one out. That one's unavailable, and that one's unavailable. So then we come down to here, destination tomorrow, unavailable. So
What?
NASA is taking down their own videos, but that one on radiation, right there.
Yep.
Radiation and space travel. I mean, that's the topic we're discussing, right?
Yep.
Unavailable.
How come the videos have been removed?
That was released June 2006, published on YouTube the 28th of October 2012, and they pulled it down.
So whoever from NASA is listening in to what we're talking about, keep taking notes because you're exposing NASA as being an organization that can't withstand scrutiny.
It's funny how they pulled down the ones on radiation. I just hit the link where Brian Cox is talking in his car, calling us a bunch of idiots. Right? It doesn't open either.
Because he was being particularly rude. Said it's good to watch something on television when you think I don't agree. I see you thought about it. Professor Alice Roberts.
So Brian would have pulled that one on the car, and he would have pulled it because he was doing stuff. And when he did the knob end thing and couldn't spell it right, I mean, that pretty much shut him down. Like most of the other links are there, but there's 3 or 4 in here that just should be here.
You know, anything that's going to make him look silly is going to be taken down. I mean, he'll take it down. I mean, he'll just put in a request and down it comes.
Yeah. Or perhaps the university that he's working for would put the request in.
But it is interesting, though, about what Marcus was saying, though. Why doesn't Brian Cox or Neil deGrasse Tyson or any of those guys just say something?
Well, Neil does every now and again on Star Talk, because I do watch him there. His biggest thing, he says, you see the size of that rocket? See how big it is? You know how much fuel that's holding? It'll get you anywhere. You got that much fuel? Yeah, except the problem is the first stage, which is 80% of the fuel, is gone in 2 minutes and 42 seconds.
But what about the fuel that's in the mid tank for the other ones? And then you have another fuel tank that's up higher.
But he's talking about the total aspect of the rocket. He says, you see how big it is? See how much fuel it's got? It'll get you there. Well, all of that's gone.
Because it couldn't get you there.
But then FaZe and all those guys will just say, oh, yeah, but you guys aren't important enough. You guys are all hoaxsters. Why would they want to bother with you guys?
Because it should be easy for you to show us up as being complete idiots if you agreed to discuss it with us, but you're not prepared to. That is what is so tragic about it.
They haven't put the time or energy in to be able to discuss it. That's the important thing about Into the Lion's Den. That was the most important thing. You had the most knowledgeable people, and in particular Jerry Stone, who has spent 45 of the 50 years of Apollo presenting this information and had unique access to that information long before anybody else could get their hands on it. He was given that information before it was published anywhere.
He's actually written a book about it as well, so it's obviously an area that he has great interest in. But as several people told me after my talk at the British Interplanetary Society, they told me privately that they agreed with what I was saying. Jerry Stone obviously didn't. He decided to use the Holocaust denial card as being the best way to go about it. And that was so incendiary, it was removed from his talk.
How long did that go on for? About 10 minutes or something like that?
Yeah, about 10 minutes, towards the end of his presentation. I was glad it was removed because it was so unnecessary and so completely off the subject we were discussing. But it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, that talk I gave at British Interplanetary Society, that was April 2012, 11 years ago. And it's still being posted by whoever it is, the anonymous poster of that.
Well, you've gotten under their skin.
It does appear so. They're like a dog with a bone. They think they've found a flaw in our arguments. And they're determined, oh, no, look, this is what Marcus said. It wasn't what I said. Now you can see the reality of what happened, the actual discussion, the question that was asked and my reply. You can see it.
Yeah, your reply was, it's been doctored.
Yeah.
I think the biggest problem that they have is you were in a room full of very educated people on that particular subject. It's not fly by night. They've been doing it forever. Space programs and all of the futuristic stuff, you know, imagination to reality. And I guess you can bring imagination to reality just by talking about it. That's one of the things they're very successful at. The very highly detailed aspects of the subject matter, to be able to walk in there and discuss anything with them is incredible when you think about it.
Yeah, that's true.
Do you realize what is going to happen? Let's say Artemis 3 makes it there and they find out that there's nothing there except perhaps maybe one spent Saturn V rocket or anything, doesn't matter, just a spent stage. And they realize this and the world finds out every single one of those photos ever signed by an Apollo astronaut is now worthless.
Yeah.
Every painting is worthless. Every single photograph is worthless. What are those people going to do? Ask NASA for a refund?
No, because the person who signed the photograph is doing it in a private capacity. When Buzz Aldrin was signing his photographs at $275 a time, he was doing it as a private individual.
But then you could get a lawyer to represent you in a case like that. I mean, even if he's passed away, you could still go after the estate for fraud. I mean, unless he was a limited company when he signed it.
I don't think they'd worry so much about a signature for that much money, but a $50,000 or a $500,000 Alan Bean painting might just draw a bit of legal attention.
Yeah, because it's got moon dust embedded in it.
Well, now we're really talking fraud, aren't we?
Well, the whole thing was a fraud. It was a political event. It was nothing to do with getting to the moon. It was just showing up the Russians. The trouble is the Russians are now in a position to show up America. But by not doing so, it's an interesting political dimension to that.
But even if NASA came out and said, look, it was all for political reasons, you still have these people that have paid exuberant sums of money for these so-called collector's items. So, I mean, if that was me and I paid $250,000 for a painting for an Alan Bean original with so-called moon dust in it, I would want my money back and I would sue the family or the estate to get it back.
Quite right, too.
What about the Hasselblad that goes for $500,000 at an auction in Sotheby's? I mean, come on, you're going to want your money back.
Yep.
You know, see, that's going to be a real big problem for them.
Yeah, they probably thought about it already and wondering what to do.
Yeah.
And there's probably going to be some, as soon as we start seeing, well, it was all done by private individuals. If somebody chose to buy a camera that was supposed to be on the moon, I don't know which camera it was.
But what I think is going to happen is Artemis 3 is going to be full of stage props. And then when they get there, they can just dump them out and say, hey, there's this, right? You know, it's just like the inflatable tanks that they used during World War II, so that the Allies looked up and they see, oh, wait a minute, those are tanks down there. Oh, no.
They were called Potemkin villages when Russia was constructing false villages to try and fool people that they had much more than they do. Hence all the fake Apollo stuff. It's to fool people into thinking that something happened that didn't actually happen.
I mean, they look at all the museums they have that are just full of artifacts.
Yes, and then what's going to happen to that? I mean, they have moon rocks. What? Now they don't have them. You know what I mean? This is going to cause a very big stir.
Yeah, and that is one of the reasons that they don't dare. They do not dare admit to anything to do with the NASA Apollo fraud.
You know, and then Raza comes out and he says, well, that NASA will blow the whistle on themselves once they finally do get a man on the moon, but I can't see how that can happen because of the repercussions that are going to occur once that happens. Yeah. Like, i.e., again, back to the paintings, back to the artifact, back to the moon rocks in the museums, back to all this, everything that was supposed to have gone. That's a big conundrum.
Yeah, and the museums are interconnected with a lot of their air and space museums, right? So they have the attachment in some of those museums. They've created them into interactive models from their old warplanes on through, right? You get inside them, you can actually step inside them, and it has a simulator in there to fly it. It's not just a static display anymore.
But even in a video game like that, as long as the prop is moving back and forth when they're making movements with a joystick, even the kids are not going to be able to fly that thing because they're going to be rocked back and forth and it's going to be moving the joystick.
Oh, they put limitations on it. It'll land every time for them.
Yeah.
It's going to repeat the path that Apollo did in their programming, right? They're going to put that in there so the kids can be doing anything they want to. It's simply going to land for them, kind of thing. Like all of those displays, but those are not small museums. I mean, those air and space museums, the planes are actually outside in a yard, the huge buildings, right? They got them indoor and outdoor with the military planes and everything else that they've got. But they've also got all of the Apollo equipment inside, enough of them. And of course, Houston, they redid the entire computer, like the entire control room has been rebuilt, right? You go in there and you go through the Apollo 11 landing in there in simulation and people working in front of the screens, and they've reproduced them all. I mean, all that equipment could be run off a cell phone by this, in today's world, but they so-called reproduced all of the equipment, or so-called brought it back to life. And if they actually did, and it worked so well then, they could just sit down and use that control room.
Well, it's the same thing. I mean, Marcus, I don't know if you've seen this one yet, but Raza sent me this video from Tic Toc, and we were kind of taking a look at it. And these guys are trying to claim that this was from the Mercury space program. Of course, it's a fake.
Gemini 4 first spacewalk.
That's the one, yes. Now, I put this in the editor, and I wanted to see, you could actually see, if you reverse the editor and you chroma key out the black, you can actually see the wires coming down to that harness right up here, like up closer up to the top of the shoulder blades. But you'll see that the Earth is going in the wrong direction. It's spinning opposite. So it's actually going from east to west, like it's going this way. Yeah. But in this video, it's going the opposite. It's going from west to east. And when you see the Earth, how fast the Earth is actually moving in the background, it would mean the Earth's doing at least 4, maybe 5 times the speed that it normally would. Because they overlay the numbers and everything. And I says, yeah, well, that's easy now in this editor. I just take a page or anything and I can chroma key the background out just to get the letters and all the goodies on there. You just overlay that on top of any Apollo video. Boom, now you have the old-fashioned counter counting down, right? This is how they did it.
It's yet more fabrication, desperately trying to maintain the story of Apollo. You have Gemini, you have Mercury. That was all part of the Apollo program. And if they got it wrong because they didn't understand how film would work and project in space, it's now available for us all to see. So more and more information is now coming to light. I mean, the fact that you can identify the fact that the Earth is spinning in the wrong direction, because the Earth always spins in the same direction, it goes from east to west. You get it wrong, it's there for all to see. And anybody intelligent enough to be able to spot it can identify it, and NASA cannot refute it. They can ignore it, and they can get all their talking heads coming on saying what wonderful people they all are. It doesn't mean to say it makes it right. It just means that they are complicit in the fraud.